Before we begin, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell for more amazing videos. Neighbor tells man to mind own business about yard. Advice costs him yard and car. Sweet revenge. He walked out onto his porch and couldn't believe his eyes. Even after his warnings, the pavers were still there. He began to feel anger surge inside him, but then he stopped himself. Like a pro chess player, he calculated every possible outcome, playing them out in his mind. Suddenly, his stern mouth relaxed and a slow grin began to spread across his face. He knew what he was going to do about his audacious neighbor. Satisfied, he sat back and waited. Karma will take care of it, he whispered, chuckling to himself. And oh boy, was he right. New neighbor. Miles was an unassuming man. He'd worked hard for all he had in his life. He'd been a devoted husband, father, and grandfather. Now in his golden years, he was content to sit on his porch. He'd look out onto the magnificent nature reserve that bordered his new property, situated in a quiet retirement village in the country. But whenever he peeked into his neighbor's yard, he grew increasingly annoyed. Something odd. Miles looked from his tiny backyard to his neighbor's again. His neighbor's yard extended a good 8 feet beyond his. It was by far the largest property on the estate. How was that possible? At first, he assumed that the man had just been lucky or had been able to afford a larger piece of land. But it wasn't long before he knew what his neighbor was really up to. A twinge of envy. Miles was a friendly man, and he quickly befriended all his neighbors and exchanged phone numbers, including the man with the largest backyard. He felt a mixture of envy and admiration. He saw that the man also owned a cherry red sports car, something he'd never been able to afford. Nevertheless, he was content in his little slice of paradise. Until one fateful day. Strange behavior. On the day in question, Miles happened to look over and spotted his neighbor doing something strange. The man deliberately paced back and forth, walking the length of his property with a dissatisfied look on his face. He disappeared for a few minutes and then returned with a wheelbarrow full of expensive pavers. He began to lay them one by one, but he did something that had Miles doing a double take. Laying paving. The man began laying his paving from his front door. After a few hours and a lot of huffing and puffing, he had paved his entire backyard, all the way up to the old fence post that designated the boundary between his property and the reserve. Then he made a move that made Miles' jaw drop. When he stumbled upon it, he knew this was enough. It was time to act. Miles had to think of something to do. A bold move. Miles watched his neighbor brazenly stomp up to the rickety boundary fence post and rip them out one by one. Then he moved them back by 2 feet, back into the reserve, and began pounding them in again. Miles couldn't believe what he was witnessing. Now he knew why the man had such an enormous backyard. He knew he had to do something. Shattering the peace. The man was beginning to clear the land and make space for his pavers when Miles approached him. He walked up and gently asked the man to stop what he was doing. Having worked for the National Park Services, Miles thought that perhaps his neighbor wasn't fully aware of the repercussions of what he was doing. But then, all hell broke loose. Confrontation. Miles had barely gotten a word out when his neighbor rudely interrupted him. Turning aggressive to face him, he began to yell, "You're new here. I've been here 10 years, he spat. Mind your own damn business." Miles didn't have to be told twice. He left without another word, deciding that pressing the issue with the defensive man wasn't going to get him anywhere. But maybe there was another way he could make him understand. What could he do? Miles clenched his fists helplessly and watched the man complete his paving, effortlessly extending his yard by an additional 2 feet. Could he stand idly by and watch the reserve he loved get destroyed slowly by this audacious man? He must have been doing this for years. Where would it end? Then it suddenly dawned on him that he didn't have to do anything. All he had to do was watch it play out. Waiting and watching. For a full year, Miles watched and waited. It was summer again, and the reserve was eerily quiet. Many of the park's residents had traveled north for their summer holiday. This included his rude neighbor. He wasn't plotting revenge. He had a strong feeling in his gut that karma would come knocking soon. And sure enough, it did. Expenses. One bright morning, Miles was sitting on his porch enjoying the sunshine when the county came to check on the reserve. And when they saw Miles' neighbor's backyard, they were not impressed. Miles watched them pacing back and forth. Then they began to pull out maps, take photographs, and make phone calls. Then more people showed up. A notice. It turned out that Miles' neighbor had been doing this for years, pulling out the boundary fence posts and grabbing land however and whenever he saw fit. He had put the new pavers down. This was so he could park his golf cart and cherry red sports car out back while he was away for the summer. The county would have to move them before they did anything else, so they taped a notice to the man's door and left. Fines. Miles, curious, walks up to read the notice. It states that the man is in violation of encroachment upon protected lands and that he has 30 days to move his car, tear up the pavers, and pay a fine of $11,000. The fine is for damage to protected species that inhabited the protected land and for trespassing. But there was more to the situation than you'd think. A decision. Failure to comply within 30 days would result in the golf cart and sports car being towed away and impounded, and the pavers would be dug up and carted off at the man's expense. Additionally, the fine would be increasing every day past the deadline. Miles smiled to himself. Should he call his neighbor? The question floated in his mind as he smiled. Karma comes knocking. The month flew by, and the man still hasn't returned from his summer home. Just a week after the deadline, Miles was in for quite a show. He sat back and watched as they unceremoniously moved the golf cart. Then they came back for the cherry red sports car. After they towed both vehicles away, they began to tear out the fence poles one by one. He tried to warn him, but it was too late for that now. All he could do was sit back and observe karma doing its work. Getting to work. Then the pavers were ripped out and hauled away, and the old rickety fence posts and ropes were replaced with new ones. This time they were replaced with metal posts with steel cables that were deeply embedded in the ground with concrete. There was no way they'd ever be moved now. The process took weeks, and Miles' rude neighbor was none the wiser. While he was away, his place was being wrecked. Finishing up. When the contractors finished their work, the reserve was secured behind steel. Solar-powered cameras were even installed to monitor the wildlife remotely, and the notices on the neighbor's door grew with each week. Miles waited with a mixture of glee and anxiety for his neighbor to arrive back home. He was definitely in for a surprise. He hoped the man would learn something from this. He arrives. It was November when the man finally came back. Miles was in for another show. He watched him pull into the drive and walk up to the front door, which was now festooned with notices. The man read them one by one with a look of incredulity before digging out the first notice. Then he ran out to his backyard and began to scream. Fury. The man rushed back to his car to fetch his cell phone and then proceeded to call the county to find out where his sports car and golf cart were, unleashing a torrent of curses in his blind rage. Miles watched quietly from the window, smiling to himself. He knew this was what the man deserved, but he didn't think it could have gotten better. But the poetic justice of it all was still to come. Poetic justice. 3 days later, the man confronted Miles, demanding to know if he was there when the county stole his car and destroyed his backyard. Miles replied that yes, he saw it all. Well, why didn't you call me when you saw them putting notices on my door? You had my number up north. Miles paused before replying. He said that he thought about calling, but figured it would be better if he just minded his own damn business.